Okay, welcome to Not on the Beeb. This is Mark Plain with another little section with yet again another fascinating guest. Now, I keep saying all the guests are fascinating, but they truly are. And here we have Roy Williams, who has a specific insight into what's been happening with the protests and what's been happening in the country. So welcome, Roy.
Thank you. Do you want me to introduce myself?
I'd love you now just to tell us your background, because it's very specific, and give us a little detail. Give us a little detail on a bit of the job experience, because people would really love to hear.
Yeah, sure. I retired from the Metropolitan Police in 2008. My last posting was at Brixton. I was there for about 10 years. And when I was there, when I was first posted there on promotion to inspector, it was described as one of the most challenging policing environments in Europe. We were recording 900 street robberies a month when I first went there. And over time, I was part of the team that sort of reduced that to more acceptable levels at below 100. So, you know, it's fair to say I have quite a lot of operational experience. Predominantly as a uniformed officer, but obviously throughout my service I have done periods of work in plain clothes. And you know, my reason for joining the police really was to help and serve the public. And I think that was true for many people who joined around the same time as myself. And I of late, having attended a lot of the anti-protest marches, anti-lockdown. I've seen some things which have really sort of appalled me. The last time we were in London was on the 20th of March, and that's when I was interviewed by. It was an impromptu thing. I just happened to be talking to Althea, and I mentioned that I was an ex-cop, and she said, "Well, would you mind if I ask you a few questions?" And of course, I agreed. And interestingly, that little piece of video sort of became quite popular, and I think it had at least 35,000 views on Facebook, and then it was spread to other platforms. So I don't know what the final hit number was, but you know, for me, I was just really saying how I felt about things, and you know, not particularly trying to have a pop at the police per se, but just really noting perhaps the difference in the style of policing that we've traditionally seen, you know, from British police forces. And by way of an example, I might say, well, for example, you know, people you know, throw back at me, for example, well, what about the miners' strike? You know, police were politicised then. And you know, I accept that that's probably true. I was a young officer with about 2 or 3 years service at the time, but I did do about 9 or 10 weeks over that period of the miners' strike, you know, policing that. Yeah, but we were there to facilitate protest. So the pickets who wanted to stop the people going into work were allowed to do that, but the people who wanted to go to work were also allowed to go to work. And so we were very much in the middle there. And of course, the thing about the miners' strike was that it was a very emotive thing. So you would have, for example, a situation where a picket on one side of the fence wants to stop the bus, get on the bus, talk to the people who are going into work, and sometimes that could be their brother or a father or something like this. And so things got very heated on occasions. But essentially, though, we were there as peace officers to prevent a breach of the peace. And so the contrast of that kind of scenario with what we see at the anti-lockdown marches is where there's this very intrusive and aggressive manner of policing. And sometimes I kind of get the impression, at least, that certain of the officers are not really on board with getting into people's faces in the way they're being told. But what you tended to see was a lot of supervisory, a lot of supervisors, shall I say, sort of telling them, go and speak to people, you know, go and interact with people. And so, of course, then you get the first question: do you realise you may be presenting a health risk by being here? If you try to enter into any dialogue, they're not interested in that. Or they say, well, listen, I'm telling you to leave the area, go now, and that's your first warning. So at that point, you either have to decide that you're going to be arrested or you walk away.
Yeah. Just to jump in, just quickly here, just to re-establish it for people from abroad as well who are watching and don't kind of know the full history. yeah, just going back to the miners' strike, that was a very famous strikes in the 1980s. And what you just said there that I was fascinated by is your job within the police was to facilitate the protest, to let the protest to go away, but to let everyone do basically what they wanted to do. So the people who wish to go to work, you're enabling them to go to work, but you're enabling the protesters, but you were there to avoid conflict.
Yes, essentially,
and
yes.
to keep the peace. So with the UK protests, the first major protest in London was on the 29th of August. Were you at that one?
I was not at that one. No, I was at a few subsequent ones. I was at the one where Kate Shimmeramy, Robin Tilbrook, David Icke. So were there. Yeah, and that was the one where basically it was quite clear that somebody had decided that they're going to break up what they consider to be an unlawful assembly, and then the riot police came and it all kicked off. You know,
Let me just stop again for 1 second, just to give a bit of history, just to fill it out. So when the 29th happened, about 30,000 people gathered in the square. It wasn't very good weather. On that same day in Berlin, there was nearly 1 million people, which the BBC broadcast and talked about the million people there. Although they said it was 50,000 kind of Nazis, right-wing Nazis, when of course it was nearly 1 million peace protesters who converged from all over Germany, from all the hometowns, descended on Berlin, causing absolute chaos. In London, 30,000 people. At that protest, I was at the very front filming the speakers. And the police tried to edge their way in and take the gear. They did. They took a screen because there was going to be a live broadcast from America. I actually helped Del Bigtree get on. I got a call from the producer and went and spoke with the sound people. But the police just came in, and they were having chats with the organisers. They confiscated some equipment, but the organisers were like, "No, we're going ahead." They put the speakers up, and it basically went off very smoothly. Then the next protest was on the 19th, and that's one you just mentioned. Now, it was amazing weather on that day, wasn't it? So it was
really
gorgeous weather, and Trafalgar Square was completely packed out. And just to give an atmosphere for people who weren't there and didn't witness it, I've been to a lot of music festivals, and I'd equate it with the same atmosphere when a big band's coming on. People were singing and dancing before the speakers were coming on. There was music playing out. It was an incredibly good atmosphere. And the police basically waited around on the outside. A few people mingled in the crowd, doing what you just mentioned, which was just engaging with the people there, saying, we're under regulations, 2 meters apart. And people were all conversing with the policemen very gently. And then it was about 3 hours in, wasn't it? 2.5 hours in. We all noticed that riot police were gathering on the outside, and they literally stormed in. They came in, police, they came in literally running in with the shields, and they basically I'll let you pick up in a minute, but they literally just kind of stormed in, and they went straight for the speakers, and they took apart the tables, the coverings, and tried to snatch everything that was there. And the speakers,
similar to that, how officers riot police moved in, they were touching the top of their helmets like this, almost as a signal to give a signal to each other. It's like vacate the square. The riot police are going to be taking over, and so you saw them drifting off. I didn't see that myself, but somebody else observed that and related it to me. And I see no reason why that wouldn't have happened. It's as good a way as anything to communicate between themselves. But as I say, that sort of storming of the stage is not something we traditionally have seen from our police forces in this country.
No.
And of course, the premise behind that is that these people are presenting some sort of public health risk. And one thing I talked about when Althea interviewed me, I sort of mentioned that and anybody who got a ticket or was arrested, if they asked for a hearing, generally speaking, a lot of these cases were discontinued. And you've got to really start to ask, well, why is that? Is it because they have to present the evidence that they're presenting a public health risk? And I actually don't believe that they could do that, because the way in which a virus might spread between people is unclear at best. And certainly, I think the idea that it can travel from one person to another across 2 meters of space in open air is spurious at best. You know, I've got a document here, if you don't mind me just referring to it.
Yeah.
It's talking about the Spanish flu of 1918, and it talks about a little trial that was done. Bear with 2 secs. I can't find the bit of paper, but I pretty much know the story. But basically, what they did is they took 10 young naval officers who were healthy and were free of the virus, and they tried to see if they could transfer or get any one of these sailors to contract the virus by various means. So the first thing they did is they took swabs from infected people from their throats and nasal passages inside of their mouths, made a mixture from this, and then basically put it into the mouths or injected it, they may have done, into the arms of these volunteers. Not one of them contracted the virus. So then they took blood from some of the infected, injected it directly into these people. Again, none of them got infected. And there was a number of things they did like this. Not one got infected. So the trial was later repeated with 50 healthy naval officers. And again, they were unable to transmit the virus, whatever they did, you know, whatever they tried to do to transmit that. And essentially, you know, when we look at that evidence, you've got to say, well, how can they say that you know, a virus is transmitted in this way? There's a lot of evidence to suggest they're not transmitted in this way. You know, I don't know if you've heard of this. There's 2 schools of thought. One is the sort of germ theory, and the other is the terrain theory. So one is suggesting that something can invade your body like a virus, and that it can then infect your cells. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that the environment is what causes the cells to release toxins into the bloodstream that can produce flu-like symptoms, for example. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not a doctor, but I'm quite able to read what professional doctors have written and try to condense that and relate it to other people. And there's a lot of doctors who subscribe to this. And one particular doctor by the name of Stefan Lanka, he actually offered £100,000 of his own money to anybody who could prove that the measles virus exists, for example. And one doctor tried to do that, and the case ended up in High Court. But of course, he hadn't isolated a virus and he hadn't identified a virus. What he'd done is come up with a mathematical probability of how the virus would look if it existed, kind of thing. Yeah. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but essentially, you know, Stefan Lanka has been described as an expert in virology, which another doctor by the name of Dr. Thomas Cowan has said this is a bit like being an expert in unicorns, because both are very difficult to prove the existence of, which I thought was quite an amusing comment. But even talking about this other doctor, Dr. Thomas Cowan, the story he relates is about, again, about the 1918 Spanish flu. This coincided with the electrification of the Earth by the switching on of radar worldwide for the first time. Now, we've seen a similar thing here with the switching on of 5G. It's interesting, actually. I've got a letter here, and the reason I've still got this letter is because my car was broken into right outside my house, and this letter had been opened, but the intended recipient was actually a guy called the IT man, who writes in the national, it's called the NAPO magazine, which is National Association of Police, Retired Police Officers, monthly magazine that you get sent. And he did an article talking about 5G technology and how, you know, it's going to be great because it'll give you, it's just an innocuous upgrade, will allow faster communication and faster downloads. But this letter was intended to sort of challenge him and say, well, you know, are you aware, for example, there's over 30,000 studies worldwide, clinical type based studies that are verified and have been redone by other doctors who have confirmed them, that show that the effects of 5G radiation are actually quite substantial, and they affect all life, not just human life. They are very damaging to all life. Now, of course, any mention of 5G online now, you're kind of censored. You're not allowed to talk about it. And I'm not suggesting that it's purely 5G, but when you look at the fact that we've had our skies blitzed with chemtrails for the last 20 or 30 years, you know, and now we've got people being injected with a gene modifying therapy or experimental drug that they're calling a vaccine, and you take these things together, of course people are going to be having some sort of and I would suggest I don't know the definitive answer because we don't have the information accessible, but it doesn't seem an unreasonable prospect to suggest that perhaps the environment is creating the toxic terrain, if you like, that is creating flu-like symptoms because the cells become toxic and release. The cells release a thing called exosomes naturally, and they are indistinguishable from a virus. And I think the story that we've been sort of pushed on the mainstream media is that somehow viruses are alive, that they have a method of propulsion. But in reality, the doctors are unable to explain how a virus might infect a cell. You know, they just simply cannot explain that mechanism. So if they can't explain that, how are they going to explain how it jumps from one person to another across 2 meters of open space? Okay, so which brings us back to where we were. That was completely. That was compacting everything in. That was like a high-speed summary of. But I know, Mark. When we I know, Mark, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned the effect of sunspots as well, which I thought was a really interesting thing. I hadn't heard that before, but I don't know if you just want to run that by. Well, let's just go back on because we went very, very quickly there. So basically, we're in the square, the police raid. The reason the police are raiding is because there's a believed health risk, and they need to kind of break it up. Although they actually. Really, what they were actually just doing was targeting the speakers and trying to stop the speakers speaking, which is quite a crazy thing in a democracy, land of free speech. When we're meant to, you know, when we invade other countries, it's meant to be done in the name of free speech and democracy. So it's quite astonishing to have this in the heart of London in Trafalgar Square. But anyway, so then you went on to say a very, very important thing, which I want to discuss, go into much more due to the protest that's coming up. Very important weekend ahead of us on the 24th of April, which is what you pointed out is the people who were arrested. That weren't many. I can't remember how many it was, but it was not many considering the thousands and thousands that were there. It was minimal. It was absolutely minimal. It was almost the protesters behaved absolutely fantastic. You know, all the protesters basically just held the ground. There was no aggression, fighting. People kind of pushing back, tussling a bit with the police line. Nothing more than that. But when people have gone to court, which is what you're pointing out, is they haven't gone to court. People have been fined, handed out fines, things have come through. But even a lot of people didn't even get the fines through. I know that personally from a lot of protesters. That's interesting. Yeah, a lot. We'll talk about that again further. But what you're basically saying is the reason that people who paid the fines paid it, and that's one thing. But the people who stood their ground, it wasn't taken to court. The reason it's not taken to court, what you're saying, is because in a court, they have to prove the case. They have to provide evidence to prove. You have to prove the case. You have to prove the danger. Now, you went off on a fantastic spiel there, going into precisely the basis of it. So is there even a virus? Is a virus transmittable? Which can sound crazy to a lot of people, but what you brought up was the germ theory and terrain theory, and a lot of people won't be aware that right now terrain theory is as a belief, as an understanding, is accelerating like crazy. And as you summarized there, the germ theory believes in what we're being told in the media non-stop, which is pathogens, which are viruses which have been spread one-to-one, which we all presume that's what we're all brought up at school. But she said terrain theory is that no, these viruses are basically a byproduct of illness, which is caused by an environment isn't clean. We're polluted. So it's basically, in a way, it's like a form how our body's getting rid of the toxins. You know, urine, sweat,
feces is how we get rid of things, and this is just another symptom within the blood that shows up.
And breath, of course.
Yeah, and breath, of course.
Which with mask, you're breathing totally in, and
breathing it back in.
This whole number of complications you can talk about with that.
Yeah, and you, just to get to the solar power, you mentioned then you brought in 5G, which is one of those, oh my goodness me, if you say the word 5G, you put a tinfoil hat on your head. But the irony is, there might be more to tinfoil hats than we think. Now, you mentioned about solar spots. Now, I've been recommending this book. It's called Invisible Rainbow.
Oh, yes.
This is probably one of the must-reads, along with Judy Mikovich, with her book.
Yeah.
This has got to be one of the must-reads of the current era. The guy in this is a genius. This book is a testimony, and it's very laying out of all the history of electromagnetism on humans for 400 years. And what I'd mentioned to you, that you asked me about the solar flares, for people who don't know about it, this is, I mean, I was just blown away when I read this. It's game changing. Is for 300 or more years, scientists were watching what was happening with the sun, with telescopes on the sun, and they were also watching what was happening with influenza outbreaks. Now, the influenza outbreaks were not happening every year, they were happening every few years, and there'd literally be almost no cases of the flu, then there'd be an outbreak, and it'd have pretty devastating consequences, but then there'd be nothing. And what the astrologers worked out is that the influenza outbreaks matched solar flares and solar activity on the sun. Now, that can sound crazy at first hearing, except they've matched the two, which is no difference to what people must have done when they worked out the water of the sea is going up and down, and the moon up there is kind of moving, and the two work together. And of course, that's how we worked out the tides work. So we've worked out that effect of space on water, and what these scientists were doing was working out the effects of the sun on human health. Now, what those solar flares did to bring in the, going towards that incredibly toxic word 5G in more than one way, is when those solar flares happen, they create an electromagnetic storm. So we feel the effect of that on Earth, and it could be those electromagnetic waves that was causing the influenza. That's what it looks like. And of course, this is where the 5G comes in, because of course it's using electromagnetic waves in the same way. So it's just another form of increasing. But the bit in the book that completely, I slammed the book shut at this point, because I was just like, this is astonishing, is there was no electricity in Britain until 1889. And at that year, it was like a grab, with all the companies were now working out how to deliver electricity to houses, and it was like a land grab, a house grab. All these competing companies just started running cables from every house to another house, all trying to get people to sign up to electricity. And London and New York overnight ended up with people living underneath a mesh of cables above, the kind of thing you'd see in India now, in some Indian cities, or in Thailand. You can sit here because everything's been tidied up. And if you look at the graph of what happened with flu, the cases of flu were down like here and pretty steady, bumping along. And in 1889, they just rocketed and then stayed stable. And that whole thing where we were getting flu pandemic, flu instances of flu kind of hitting the population that happened every few years suddenly became consistent. So we started to experience flu every single winter. So this whole connection between electromagnetism and electricity and our health, connected to our respiratory health, is there. It's proven. So people listening who think we're a tinfoil hat, it's kind of like, well, no, this 5G is just raising things to another level.
There's actually a great site I came across called newbraveworld.org. And there's a couple of documents. I mean, here's one, for example, and it's entitled, I just downloaded it, Debunking the Official Story. And it's an examination into the true cause of COVID-19. Very interesting read. Talks about the germ and the terrain theory. And there's many other interesting articles along that theme. So I'd advise listeners to have a look at that, newbraveworld.org.
That sounds
very useful site.
A great resource. But let's okay. So we've gone to that kind of end of the theory, which is right down to 5G.
Yes, sure.
But let's wind it back into the protests, because your professional experience here is absolutely fascinating. At that first protest, when the police, they charged in, terrified people. There were kind of women with children crying, cowering against walls, because this was basically it was like an army charge as they stormed in. So anybody near it was terrifying. I caught it on camera. I was in front of, right in front when they came towards. But they did their job. They'd been told to hold a line. They held a line, and then nothing really happened from there. But then they started to clear the square, and I witnessed something. Oh dear. Excuse me, that's a big bang there. Microphone going on, so I'll cut that out. So I'll go back a bit. So what we witnessed as the police stormed in, they kind of held a line. They just tried to take away the speakers, took away the equipment. The speakers actually disappeared because they knew what was happening. They managed to find a way out, which was very interesting. That's another story. Yeah. With laughter. But then as they were clearing the square, there were some incidents, and it was shocking. I caught majority of one of these on camera, where the square is, let's say, 98% empty. The police have just started forming a line, coming through. Everyone's filtered away. Everyone knows it's kind of over. People are going home. And I was actually sitting by the fountain. I'd taken my boots off and had my feet in the fountain and was just packing away my camera gear with a flask of tea. Yeah. And the police came up and asked me if I could move out the square. And I said, okay, yeah, no problem. And then I heard a scream of help. And of course, when you hear someone shout help, you move in very quickly. What had happened, and I've watched the previous footage of what I hadn't filmed myself beforehand, but is a man had tried to walk through the square, and the policeman said, no, you can't come through the square. And he asked again, and he said, no, you need to go round. He said, well, I don't know how to get round because my bus is over there. I just like to walk through and the square's completely empty. Can I walk through? Now, he asked, that's exactly what happened 3 times. And he was arrested at that point for questioning 3 times. Now, he wasn't only arrested, he was thrown to the ground.
Yep.
Now, just to give an idea, before people get an idea of who this person is in the head, it's a 41-year-old primary school teacher who'd never had any history of anything beforehand. He'd just come on the protest. He was thrown to the ground, at which point a group of police jumped on top of him. And that's when I started hearing help. So I didn't get to see who he was, but I was aware there was a group of police. It was 6 policemen forming like a tortoise shell over him. So you couldn't actually see him underneath in a group. And then about 16, 17, maybe 20 policemen stood in a circle around on the outside to keep people back. Because, of course, once someone starts crying help, guess what happens? People start coming towards it to find out who's crying what they can do. The guy starts screaming out in pain, agony, and he's absolutely terrified. And we all started, asking the policeman, please let him go, let him breathe, because we couldn't see him. Yeah. Now, this guy became unconscious. Yeah. I filmed the whole thing. Oh, wow. They had to then call in a police paramedic who was with him for 10 minutes. I filmed the whole thing, and they couldn't bring him round, and they carried him away on a stretcher. Now, at that point, quite a lot of us thought, has he been killed? Yeah. Has he died? Yeah. And for him, I kind of went into like a form of shock because this was our police. Yeah. And people kept saying, well, why didn't you jump in and do something? And it's like, no. If it was a policeman, if it was a policeman and people were on top of him, yes, I'd have jumped in and pulled people off the policeman. But no, this was a member of the public who had our protectors over him with some sort of technique. And anyway, the whole thing is there was some very strange. These policemen didn't have the way of talking. They seemed very young. They seemed highly untrained. We've now found out that the policemen used for the riot were called TSG. Can you tell us about TSG and what? Yeah,
I mean, essentially, the Territorial Support Group are. It's a branch of the police that you can apply to join as a uniformed officer, and you get a secondment of, say, I don't know, 2-3 years, something like that. And during that time, you do a lot of physical training. You do a lot of public order training with the use of shields and obviously non-lethal weapons such as tasers, batons. Down in Hounslow, for example, they've got a public order centre, which is basically a mock city where they produce scenarios. You have a crowd, and then you have the riot police come in to disperse that crowd. This kind of thing. So they're quite highly trained in public order management, and you've probably heard it. Sorry, excuse me, I've knocked the thing there. But you've probably heard it where you get this thing like, get back. This is the first warning you get. What they're telling you is, don't come any nearer because I'm going to clobber you with my baton. But this kind of these police generally are not used as the first resort. They're normally brought in if a thing escalates into violence. Now, if we go back to the 26th of September, for example, we had moved from Trafalgar Square and we all ended up in Hyde Park. Now, I can tell you that the majority of people there, 99.9% of them were sitting down. There were children, there were families with pets. This was a peaceful crowd. And all of a sudden, we saw the blue riot vans come down the side of the park, and a couple of them clicking the sirens just as a sort of wind up, Then we see this wave of officers, hundreds of them in a line, just moving towards the peaceful crowd. And again, that's when it started. This is when I saw the incident regarding the guy with the guitar that I spoke to Althea again about. But basically, this guy, he was annoying. He was obviously annoying them. But one officer decided he had enough and just jumped on him. And of course, a similar thing to the incident you described, 6 or 7 others then protect the first officer from the friends who were trying to pull him away, etc. Now, what happened there, though, is that the crowd then engulfed this crowd of 10, 12 officers, and they were basically marched backwards towards the fence because they weren't going to let go of their prisoner, despite the fact he hadn't done anything. And then, obviously, we then had other distractions. For example, the speaker, the doctor, I forget his name now, who was about to speak at Hyde Park Corner. That's when we had yeah, that's right, yeah. And that's when we had the incident where the riot police are coming in just to take him away. And all he was doing was, give a speech about something that was a...
Yeah, let me just come in, because that's the story we want to go into detail on. But let me just set up what was happening on the 26th for everybody who wasn't aware of it. So we had the first protest was on the 29th of August that was left alone. The police were very gentle, took it away. Then we had the 19th. One set of organisers that was raided by the police, and then on the following weekend that was set up by Save Our Rights, but it was almost a complete repeat of what happened on the 19th. The police raided again after about 3 hours. Now, just to say, I want to really establish this at the Trafalgar Square. It was incredibly peaceful. Now, a policeman had died in, I think it was in
that's right, in Croydon.
In Croydon, was it? Okay, in Croydon. Yes. And just to give an idea how the crowd, there was a minute silence given for the policeman.
Absolutely,
the crowd was absolutely silent and total respect. And people were calling out, the speakers were calling out to the policeman just to listen to the information. And it was when the police raided again, so it was almost a carbon copy. And they came on as Dr. Schoening, who had flown in from Germany when he was on stage. So everyone disbanded in Trafalgar Square, and then a lot of people then moved on, formed a march, and then went to Hyde Park, which is where you picked up the story there. And as you said, the vast majority of people sat down, peaceful protesters around. And then Dr. Schoening then went to speak at Speaker's Corner, which is the one place in the country which has got a history of people of free speech going back hundreds of years. It's the one place, doesn't matter what political belief you have, you're allowed, you get on a soapbox, you stand there and speak. So Dr. Schoening has flown in from Germany as a doctor. He was dressed in his suit, in a smart blue suit, goes to start speaking, and then the riot police move in to take him away. Yeah,
ridiculous. I mean, that is a kind of direct assault by the government on our right to freely assemble and speak. Right there. It couldn't be any more poignant, could it?
He was handcuffed and he had his files taken.
I think he was handcuffed, and of course they had to protect him as they walked him out because the crowd were engulfing them, and quite rightly, a lot of people were really upset about that.
I was outside the Wandsworth police station the next day. I went to see his release, and they kept him in. I don't know how many hours it was, 22 hours or something, but they confiscated the book that he's part of, which is this one. By coincidence, I've got it by my desk. And he was laughing, and he goes, "I hope they read that." They confiscated his laptop. And this is a doctor coming to speak. And then just to give an idea on the censorship, because I'm hot on the censorship, because free speech is so important. But I filmed him as he came out of the station, and again filmed his speech. And that little video clip, it went viral, but it was one of the most hotly censored pieces of film I've seen. People who borrowed the footage off me have never been banned on YouTube, got their strikes and banned. It was getting struck down everywhere for a suited German doctor just giving his thoughts. And isn't this is just...
Yeah, it's just one step behind, isn't it? I mean, as a result of, but from the 20th of March, it's really that day that I decided that, if people were so interested to hear the little bit that I'd said to Althea, maybe I should consider, expanding upon that and maybe doing something with my own circle of influence. And I decided to stand for Sussex PCC in the 2021 elections. And so
you're coming out of retirement for this.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And I've got to be honest with you, even if I'm successful, I don't really particularly relish being back in that kind of police corporate environment, if you like, but I can tell you this: if I am successful, I will be a new broom in that office, because as far as I can see, the existing PCC is just an extension of the government and the police in Sussex. So I don't know if you want me just to talk about what my campaign is based upon. I mean, it's very quickly, but of course we talk.
Let me just establish two things. Yeah, let me just establish two things first of all. So, what you decided this after the 20th of March. So for people, a lot of people will be watching this who are not aware of what the 20th of March is, but the protesting in Britain went very quiet over the winter from Christmas, but they all kicked up again on the 20th of March without any organizer. Without any organizer involved. This was a people's march, and it completely surprised everybody, including a lot of the protesters, because we must have numbered 100,000. There's 3 different marches, at least, whole of central London, and even the BBC had to acknowledge it because the whole of central London was brought to a standstill. And there's some amazing footage of people, all the buses beeping the horns and cars giving
and I think the interesting thing about that one, Mark, was that it was an organic thing. I think people I think it was advertised there was a worldwide anti-lockdown protest, so people thought, well, if it's worldwide, I'm going to go. And I must admit that in the morning of that of the 20th of March, I was at home. I'd actually got a bad foot, and I didn't fancy walking around London for a few hours. So, but when I saw how many people were there, I thought, I've got to go. I can't just not go. And I think maybe other people who'd seen it early in the morning did the same as well. So as the afternoon went on, the crowd just seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah. And unlike the early anti-lockdown protest, the police, even if they had wanted to stop it, had no chance of stopping it. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about that march was, you having been holed up during the whole of the winter, a lot of people living in fear because their only source of information they rely on is the TV and the local newspaper. Living in absolute fear. So for many people who have that kind of fear, it's really useful and really great for them to attend one of these assemblies and talk to other like-minded people, and realise that you're not alone sitting in your house. It is a good way to network with other people, and it relieves some of that anxiety, because I've got a feeling the one on the 24th of March, I don't think this is a worldwide one on the 24th of April. I don't think it's a worldwide one, but I think the May one is a worldwide one. But I do anticipate the one on the 24th of April is going to be huge. I think there's going to be a lot more than there were on the 20th of March. And I hope it is. I'm certainly going to be there, and I hope I'm sure you'll be there too. Yeah. So I think more and more people are sort of waking up to what's going on and realising that the whole of our sort of liberties that our ancestors have fought for over centuries are being eroded and attacked by this government. And I, for one, am not happy with it.
No, and this is, the atmosphere, just to say again, the atmosphere on the 20th was just absolutely astonishing, fantastic. And the police realising they were completely, I don't know whether it was it was pre-decided or, like you said, the numbers were too big, but they were fantastic. It was a complete change in behaviour we saw. They held back, they walked alongside some parts of the match. They were doing that kind of just keeping keep looking after the public, just looking after the safety, making sure the roads stopped, the traffic wasn't coming into the protesters. We're doing a great job. And when I saw the watching how they cleared Trafalgar Square, it was completely the opposite. They were engaging with the public and asking to go. Their patience was there. Their patience was back. So they were, you know, when the public weren't, some of the members weren't going, and they were just.
Well, interestingly, I was interestingly, I was approached by somebody who asked me whether I'd be willing to head up a group called Police for Freedom. I haven't looked into it yet, but I think this movement started in Spain, and this was related to where some certain Spanish police who were policing the protest there took their helmets off in support of the people, and I think we saw a similar thing in Italy as well. Yeah, and it stemmed from that, and somebody in Spain started a group. But what they're trying to do is organise it so that all countries in the world have this kind of solidarity with the people from the police. Now, as I say, one thing at a time for me. I'm trying to focus on this PCC election first, but in principle, I don't mind sort of like looking into that. And if they do need somebody to spearhead that in this country, maybe I'd be the guy to do it. So we'll see. Absolutely. But
I want to tell you a bit more about what's happening, how that happened in Spain. So the group that set it up, I believe, weren't members of the police, or it might have been a few members. But basically, what was happening is people went and printed information off the site that was designed for police officers to explain to them what was happening, what their rights were, whether they had to carry out commands. And people going to their local Guardia Civil, their local police. They've got 3 types of police in Spain. They were handing these leaflets and then engaging with them. And that ended up with the first police-only protest in Valencia.
Oh, yes.
So it was a protest just with policemen on, which was just fantastic. So all the police came out, and of course that got the ball rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that
well,
hit.
Can I mention? Can I mention something? Because on my Facebook page, I got an ex-colleague who I used to know. I didn't know him that well, but he's still in the Met, I believe. And he started to attack me as a sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, this kind of thing. And we had all the dialogue of our, he's on there if anybody wants to go and have a look at it. It makes quite interesting reading. And I've said to him, well, at the end of the day, this is a matter of conscience, and I'm quite happy with my conscience. I'm not happy with what I'm seeing. I've seen some thugs in uniform, quite literally, and I like to think that, well, of course, during 30 years as a police officer, you've been involved in violent incidents, but I hope that I was never a thug when I was in the police, and I never considered myself to be one, and I always considered that we were there to serve the public and not to oppress them. And I just kind of feel that nowadays that has changed. It's just turned on its head, hasn't it? And I'm not saying that's true of all police, because I think undoubtedly there will be serving officers who are uncomfortable with what they're being asked to do, and sort of part of my campaign is to say, well, I'm not happy with the police being used as an enforcement arm of the government stroke NHS. We've never been used, the police have never been used in that capacity before. Why are they being used, like this now? So I think I'm not the only police officer who's retired who has spoken out. I know there are a number of others. I've not actually been in contact with any of the others. I'm just doing my own thing, really. But as I say, if there is a facility later to link up with people, because I just because I've been attacked by one officer who has a certain view, that doesn't mean, for example, that his view is correct, or So I mean, one thing he attacked me on is because one of my campaign promises is that I will try to ensure that women have not just women, vulnerable people generally will have the facility to carry a noxious spray on the street to protect themselves. And I could talk about the Sarah Everard case, and you could say, well, if she had a pepper spray or something, and that would have given her a minute or 30 seconds just to be able to get away far enough that she would have still been alive today. Now, he's attacked me. So, where does it stop? What next? Knuckle dusters, flick knives. But of course, the difference between those kind of weapons is that they will cause permanent injury. And as much as a pepper spray might sting for a while, ultimately there will be no lasting permanent injury. So there's a whole difference there straight away. And, I have no intention of suggesting that we turn the streets into the Wild West. But equally, the idea that the police can protect women on the street is a myth. You know, they have too many demands. There are no just simply not enough resources for them to do that. So let's give them back what is essentially a fundamental constitutional right to bear arms. You know, but I think there has to be controls around that. Of course, if somebody's got a history of mental illness or previous convictions for violence, these might be barriers to a person applying. But generally speaking, if people are of sound mind and they're lawful abiding citizens, why shouldn't they be able to carry such things on the street to protect themselves? And you could prescribe the conditions in which they may be able to use those things, and you might even be able to offer some local training from the local police as to how and when they should be used. So I'm not suggesting we just go out there and they can buy them over the counter, but that said, that's what they can do in France, and they don't seem to have a problem there. No. But I do understand that a lot of people might think that to be a bit of a radical thing. We'll have pepper spray fights on the street, etc. This kind of thing. But I'm not sure that would be the case. And I think if there is a pepper spray used, the circumstances in which it used would need to be reported. So if a woman was attacked by a male and she used it, that's a quite legitimate use. But if she was subjected to a bit of verbal abuse on the street and decided to use it, that perhaps wouldn't be acceptable. And, we could consider whether she should continue to be able to carry one. But so I'm not suggesting, there has to be a framework. But what I'm saying in principle, I don't have a great problem with that. And, but of course, I expect that, I will take a bit of flack from people about that idea. But, at the end of the day, I'm being quite upfront about things I believe, and people will either agree with that or they'll disagree with it, and you can either vote for me or not vote for me, but at least I'm being upfront with what I'm standing for.
No. And just tell us again what the CCP is precisely and what your
the PCC, Police Crime Commissioner. So they're elected every 4 years, and basically their role is to hold the chief constable of the area in which they cover, in this case Sussex, for the nature and style of policing. So for example, with the Mayor of London, he has the dual role as the Mayor and as the PCC. So what he did when he came into power is that he said, right, £2 million will be given to the Metropolitan Police to look at Islamophobia online, right? So that's something he decided was a priority for him, and obviously the police got the funding for that. But in the same vein, you can defund things. One of the things I talk about is the right to free speech, and when you start to get into that arena, you have to acknowledge that although in principle, I'd like to be able to say anything I like when I like, but you've got to understand that, of course, if your speech is likely to stir up racial hatred or violence, these things need to be tempered, and so the law can restrict what freedom of speech is to some degree. And even if I decided, for example, by way of a social experiment, to say, well, within Sussex we will not prosecute hate crime, we will allow people to say what they want, but with that freedom comes a responsibility, and that responsibility will be that you've got to understand that your speech can stir up hatred, can stir up anger, and that you have to be aware of that, because if you can't report a crime and ask for the police to help you, you might get direct karma coming from things you've said, for example.
But this is a really dangerous ground, though, because
it is. Yeah,
we're caught in a bit of a catch-22 situation, because with the information we're giving out about vaccine damage, there's a huge amount of people being injured right now. Now we're getting called. When we disseminate that information, we're getting called anti-vaxxers. And anti-vaxxers has now been equated by the government, certain politicians have hinted that that's equivalent to terrorism, national terrorism. So,
well, I hear the words, but my view is that's nonsense. Of course, it's not. It's not, because essentially, there's an argument that says, and I would ask your readers, your listeners, to perhaps have a look at my Facebook page, where you'll see two questions that I put to the Chief Constable and the serving PCC, and they're pretty lame answers in response. So I don't know if you've looked at those, but what I do in the first question is I lay out three official documents from the World Health Organization and the Rockefeller Institute, and so what I'm sort of using as source to frame my question is official documents from established organizations, and you'll see from that there is a lot of evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic is actually a plandemic or a scandemic, and there's evidence to support that statement. And so my question to the PCC and the chief were, well, were the police part of that plan? Because when we look at the intrusive nature of policing since this COVID-19 thing came in, you could argue that the police are being used as a strong arm to further their agenda, which the agenda, of course, end goal would be to increase the number of vaccination take-ups. That seems to be the case to me. Now, if that makes me a domestic terrorist, well, what can I say? All I'm trying to do is search for the truth. And when I talk about freedom of speech, that's one of the things I kind of hit upon, because I'll give you an example. You talked about they use the term anti-vaxxer or COVID-19 skeptic, or Holocaust denier is the other big one, of course. So all of these terms are generated by the mainstream media, and they seek to sort of immediately erode the argument you're saying by a little bit of name calling, essentially. And yet, if people take the time and look at the evidence, because I think if we're going to make a statement, we need to look at the evidence. When mainstream media is censoring evidence from professionals in their field, in virology, epidemiology, consultants, specialists, you've got to question why. Because we're told that, no, we have to trust the science, and the science, as far as they're concerned, comes from three people: Whitty, Vallance and Ferguson.
Who aren't scientists. But the thing is, this is the thing. If we've got something to debate, if it's a scientific fact, it's data, it can be debated. And if someone comes up with something that's nonsensical, you fight it into the ground. Of
course you do. Yeah, of course.
And that's how you win the discussion. But censorship is like, I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to hear what you're going to say. And it's like, we all know what happens in personal relationships when people do that. It doesn't lead to anything. And this is what's happening on a national level, because we need the dissenting opinions, and all that should be happening. They should be, if anything, they should be given extra platform for discussion, and we should knock them down. Same with terrain theory. Let's just all get out there and talk about it, and let's just see, and let's just get the evidence out.
But when we see, for example, when we see our own health minister with somebody like Bill Gates, who is a self-confessed eugenicist, and has said in a TED talk that if we do a good job with vaccines and reproductive services, we can reduce the global population by 10 to 15%, and genocide is the only hope for mankind. You've got to say, well, whoa, hold on. I'm not entirely comfortable with our health minister speaking to this guy. And at the end of the day, who is Bill Gates? He's not a doctor. He's a computer nerd. And yet he has so much influence. He owns most of the big pharma companies, and I don't think it's all about. It's not about the money for him. Of course, it's about depopulation. He's part of the depopulation agenda.
But he's using his money for that influence. So he's bought his way in. He's buying people. He's bought the media. Down to the BBC, I'm going to go, not on the Beeb, but this is, I can't believe that someone has managed to, I only started this. I don't want to be doing this. I've got like a career of myself that I've just stopped to get this going. I don't want to be doing this. But when the BBC didn't turn up on that first protest, I was like, hang on, 30,000 people in Trafalgar Square, and you're trying to pretend it didn't happen. But Bill Gates he's got his tentacles into the BBC that's meant to be impartial for the British public. That's why everyone pays their license fee, is to have kind of investigative journalists doing their job, finding things out, and that's not
simply not happening, is it? Simply not happening. But I mean, if you think about some of the things I'm kind of standing for, I'm really going back to early legislation, higher tier legislation, constitutional legislation, which protects our inalienable rights. People say, well, you've got the right to peaceful protest. Well, I've got a book here. I've got a book here called The English Constitution. I'd like you to look at the picture on the front of that, because there, part of the English Constitution says that we have the right to petition the king, is how it's phrased, right? And that is an inalienable right that means it can't be interfered with by the state, and it remains in perpetuity, which means forever and ever. It says that at least 3 times in that act. Now, I'd like you to notice that the idea of a peaceful protest is certainly not represented in that front cover picture, is it? You know, and any commitments or prosecutions against people for carrying out that activity are illegal. It's quite clear about that. You know, so this when the TSG are getting in the faces of people, telling them to go home, that's illegal, because essentially those protests amount to petitioning the Crown. That's my personal view of it.
Just a bit more.
I'm sure people could put another argument against that, but that's how I feel about it.
Tell us a bit more about this, because I was very interested when you first told me about this. The base of law, meaning that the Coronavirus Act is basically illegal. Is that right? Yeah. Well, basically, yeah. Your constitutional rights trump later legislation such as the Coronavirus Act or the Control of Diseases Act of 1984. You know. As simple as that, and any perceived health risk is something, the risk that the attendees take. Of course, we're told that, well, you know, you may not have symptoms, but you could be passing it on to somebody else. And well, you know, actually, if you went to the doctors and said, you know, doctor, I'd like you to examine me. So, well, you know, first thing you say is, well, what's wrong with you? Well, you know, what are your symptoms? Well, I haven't got any symptoms. All right, well, you go home. But all of a sudden, they're giving us this idea that you can have no symptoms, not be affected in any way, shape or form, but you're a danger to other people. And you've seen these posters in London, behave as if you've got it, you know. Why? You know, I just don't buy it. And of course, if we get back into that germ stroke terrain theory argument, but of course, Big Pharma loves the germ theory, of course, because it's great. Because if they give you the impression that there's these things that can invade your body and infect you, then they've got things that they can give you and sell you that can stop that happening. And what better than an ongoing vaccine that they have to change every month for a new variant? You know, and this idea that they're identifying variants, they're not identifying anything. They haven't. These are just mathematical models of new viruses that they think may exist. Well, the science is just not there to support it. You know, it's just not there. You know, they haven't even isolated the original strain, apparently, not been isolated from a live patient. And there's a test that viruses have to meet, which is called the Koch's postulates, and they haven't met any of those. You know, I'm sure you're aware of this yourself, Mark, but to me, I just think, well, you know, interestingly, I'll just touch on this. There's a case that has been brought by a guy called Michael O'Bernicia. Yes. It's a private prosecution. And basically, he's done 2. He did the first one he did because he tried to get a case against all politicians or members of parliament who voted for the first Coronavirus Act to be implemented, on the basis that 3 days before they voted, it was the World Health Organization came out and said that there was that COVID was not a what do they call it? A highly contagious infectious disease, right? So they all knew that. Well, we can't say they all knew, but a lot of them would have known that this was the case, and yet they still voted for this draconian piece of legislation called the Coronavirus Act. Now, that case didn't succeed, and I think the reason being it was a bit too wide, and it wasn't specific enough. So this but the court didn't throw it out as it has been a case without merit. What they did was they said, if you're going to pursue a case like this, we need a prima facie case. And if I can just sort of talk about this for a minute. So, for example, if you're arrested, if you're suspected of an offence by the police, you generally speaking, the process would be you would be arrested. You'd be taken to the police station, have your fingerprints, photographs, DNA taken, and you would be interviewed about your involvement in this allegation. At the end of that interview, a decision will be made whether you should be bailed pending further inquiries or whether you should be charged. And if they're going to charge you, they charge you. And if they have no insufficient evidence, don't think they're going to get any more, they'll release you without charge. So that's the system.
The difference with a private prosecution is that that stage of the process, if you like, is missed. So what happened is the information is laid at, I think he laid it at Westminster Magistrates Court. The legal team there and possibly a judge look at the strength of the case to decide whether it should be listed. And it's since been sent from that court to Bromley Magistrates Court for listing, and which means that potentially it's already been identified that there is a prima facie case. But what he's done this time is he made it very specific. It's against Hancock, Vallance, Whitty and Ferguson. And it's there's an interesting radio, if you type it in, updates to the PCP, the Bernician or something like that, you'll find it. And it's a great hour-long discussion about the current case. They have a ex-fraud detective on it, who has basically said it's one of the it's a really strong case. They will struggle to say there's not a case to answer. So that's reassuring. But the thing about these private prosecution cases is that they can be taken over by the Crown Prosecution Service at any time. So they could come in, take over it, dismiss it, for example. I think they'd have to provide sufficient argument to do that, but in principle they can do that. However, if this case is successful, then obviously we then get back to the get into the next level of it, if you like, which says that, well, if they committed this fraud, why did they commit the fraud? What is it that they were committing the fraud for? What was their objective? And of course, you could say, well, the main reason was to increase the uptake of the vaccination program. And then if you start to examine the vaccination program and get into some of the data related to how many people have died since they've took different versions of the V, you'll start to come up with a picture that's quite disturbing. People have been dying from it, and of course they'll say, "Oh well, yeah, he had the vaccine, but he caught coronavirus and died from that." What? So, oh yeah, it was a different strain. These kind of arguments. So that they're going to use this these increasing deaths as a reason to ramp up even further the restrictions on our liberties, etc., etc. So you can see where it's going, and I don't know. It's hard to say whether that will be a successful prosecution, but I strongly hope it is. And from what I've read about it and heard about it, I see no reason why it shouldn't be. So yeah, let's see if they issue summonses for the 4 of them by the end of the week. That'll be interesting.
Yeah, it's very exciting times. I know some people putting in some of the data, and they're looking. I tell you now, this case. If there's anybody out there, frontline nurses, doctors, who have witnessed what's going on with the amount of people that are coming into A&E with vaccine reactions, case needs your evidence. So if you want to whistleblow and go on the quiet, come on the website. I've got an encrypted email now. You can do it that way, or find another way to make contact. We'll never release your names. We'll do everything we can to protect you. There's lawyers behind the case, some very big lawyers protecting other whistleblowers. Sorry, not behind the case. That's Michael's case with his investigators. But for whistleblowers, we've got lawyers lined up who will step in and protect people. So they need more evidence. If you've got evidence for this genocide, and I'm going to call it out as a genocide.
It is genocide.
I'm watching the numbers coming in, and it's a genocide, and it's going to be hidden, but we're going to uncover it. But if you can get any evidence across, they need that for the case, and we can hopefully bring it to a standing still. But let's come back. I mean, that's a very exciting case. There's lots of other things being fought out around the world, in Germany, America, some lovely big cases as well. But we know, and a lot of people do, a lot of people are all sat at home feeling, because this is the first time in history, we've had we've had world wars before, but we had leaders in the country. In World War II, there was Churchill there, basically leading the people and how to tackle the enemy. But right now, we're in a completely different situation, because the people who are our enemy are our so-called leaders.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's a unique position, and so it's the people now having to work out what to do. And the biggest thing we can obviously do is just get on the street in quantity. So we want everyone to come out on the 24th. So as with all your policing experience, what can you, I know there's all the hardcore protesters who are going to come out. There's the people who came out on the 20th and got their confidence, but there's a lot of people at home who don't want conflict. They don't want to get arrested. They don't want to be in any trouble. What would be your advice for those people?
Well, I would advise them to make every effort to be there. It is a festival stroke, that family type event. And the more of us that are there, the less chance the police have of stopping us protesting. And it is your constitutional right to do so. So lose the fear, use it as an opportunity to network with like-minded people, or even if you're on the fence about some of this stuff, you know, because all you've relied upon is your for your information is the mainstream media. And I understand totally. I'm not criticising people who have been taken down that path, because a lot of people, they have families, they have full-time jobs, they're trying to balance work and play, and it's nice to sit down in front of the TV at night and watch the news, and you know, and if that's your only source of information, then obviously you are going to be in that category of people who probably believe what the government's saying, perhaps through a combination of fear and you know, well, what's the alternative? And then, of course, a lot of people have been promised they can go on holiday abroad if they take the jab, you know, and yet, of course, we've seen that even though you've had the jab, you still can't go, you know. So the government is lying to you, you know. Don't trust them. They have become the enemy of the people, as far as I'm concerned. You know, we can question their legitimacy in some sense, because when you look at this government, they derive their power from the United Kingdom. Well, we could question whether the United Kingdom is still a United Kingdom, because we have a separate assembly for Scotland, we have a separate assembly for Northern Ireland, a separate assembly for Wales, and England is the only nation within that group that doesn't have its own representation. And they derive their power from the Acts of Union, you know, where they are, which leaves us in a bizarre position where you get Scottish MPs that can vote upon English matters, which is ludicrous. And so, you know, I think if I could gain any traction for anything, I'd be advocating we can still be a group of nations, but we need our own assembly in England. And if we have our own assembly in England, that would take the power from Westminster immediately. Think about that for a moment.
That's interesting.
Problem gone. Problem gone. And that's it. And you know, many communist revolutions. This is Karl Marx himself saying this. Many communist revolutions have fallen upon the rock of the English Constitution. That's a powerful statement from the guy who invented communism. You know. So anyway, just a few closing things. I hope you don't mind as a little plug at the end here, Mark. I just wanted to talk about my campaign promises. That I'm an English constitutionalist. I'm not a politician. All right. So sometimes I'm going to get things wrong, but I'll say what I feel, and I will be honest in what I say. So I'm campaigning on three things. One, women can protect themselves on the street, as we discussed earlier. Two, the police will not be used, in Sussex at least, as a strong arm of the government or the NHS to enforce public health policy. And thirdly, even if they try to impose further lockdowns, I will be encouraging local businesses and local bars and restaurants to stay open. And of course, if they believe that there is a virus and they want to make their customers feel safe, then sure, put the appropriate measures in place that they feel they need to do that. But please don't let this government destroy your businesses. It's a common law right to earn a living, and it should be free without interference from the state. So that's my kind of things. I've been having questions from all corners about all sorts of things, and I'm trying to keep on top of a lot of these questions. And I'm trying to be a little bit more accessible than the current serving PCC. So I'm hoping I can do that between now and the 6th of May, the date of the election. But I'd ask as many people as possible to come out and vote for me, because if you vote for Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem or Green, you are not going to see any change. I'm an individual standing up for our individual constitutional rights. So power to the people.
Everybody in Sussex, if you've got friends in Sussex, please get them a video, because we've got an insight here into who you could be voting into power to be looking after us. And I just want to end on one little note again. I just want to talk about the protest again on the 24th.
Sure.
I believe, and I just want to check this with you, with the people who are nervous about coming, and I know For every one person there was 9 people who didn't come because they were nervous. What I'd suggest to those people, from my experience, is they just come into London and they're just there in London. If they want to walk with the protest, they can walk with the protest. But there was small groups forming. There'll be small protests forming. People can just walk in those groups. If they don't want light crowds, they can stay in the smaller crowds. If they want to walk in the protest, and for any reason they see any form of activity, if the police block away, they can turn around, walk away, and go somewhere else. And just people, if the people are really nervous, just walk away and put your mask. If you wear a mask, put your mask back on your face, walk away. But we just need a show of heads. We don't need people. It doesn't need everybody in a placard at the front. It doesn't need everybody pushing ahead. It just needs a volume of people. So please, everyone come. And just to establish with you, this is the big thing, because I think some people will think, and I'm to blame for this. So one of the reasons I want to put this out is because, of course, when I've gone to the protests, which have got these amazing atmospheres, when I've seen these basically atrocities or police violence, I've focused my camera on them. And of course, those are the bits that go viral. So everyone then thinks it's all full of violence. And this is what
of course, yeah.
And on the 20th, there was a tiny disturbance after, with some stone throwing, with some bottles left over in a little bit of Hyde Park. But the vast majority, 99% of the whole march had disappeared. It was just some people who were left behind who didn't like being moved on by the police. But that's a separate story. But so for everyone else, I just say, just go into the protest. And if for any reason, if a policeman asks you to move, if you move, you're not going to be arrested on the first time, right? Yeah,
exactly. Absolutely, yeah. And there's no point in trying to enter into dialogue with them, because they just won't listen. So if they've been instructed to enforce the legislation, Coronavirus Act legislation, then that's what they'll do. But yeah, even at Trafalgar Square, when they decided to start picking on the crowd as it thinned, which is one of their tactics. If you've just walked away, as I did, we just walked to Hyde Park and we were left alone, So, yeah, I would certainly say to people, lose the fear. Fear is what they use as their biggest tool, as we've seen from the media, the fear porn media campaign over the last year. Lose the fear, get out on the streets, and let's show our solidarity.
Yeah, and I can tell now that these events are just absolutely fantastic, because we all have to deal with all the news. But when you go on the event, the feeling when you come back is just, having been with so many people with no fear, it's just it's like being to a big, like you said, like a street party. It's just the most amazing feeling. And I'm often buzzing for days and days after. So let's see you there.
Okay.
Let's see you there.
I look forward to it, Mark, and I hope to see you there myself. And looking forward.
You'll find me by the live stream. So if you could go on the
I will
live stream, and then you can hunt me down to see where I am. But come and say hello there, Roy. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks for your time. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.